Hey guys, this is Jeff, and I just have a quick disclaimer for you before I get started with the video today. This is a very long one. I cover a lot of ground, so what I've done is I'm going to pin a comment below this video with some important timestamps, and if you feel like you want to skip past some of these parts of the video, I certainly don't blame you. You may not be interested in exactly how what these graphs mean exactly. You're just wanting to understand, what is the impact of all of this, and I understand that. So I'm just going to put some timestamps down in a pinned comment below, and feel free to skip around at your leisure. I would encourage everyone to definitely watch the last parts of the video because I think there's some important conclusions. So with that, let's go ahead and get started with the video. Hello guys, this is Jeff Carter with another COVID-19 update for you. A few days ago I said that I would be working on an update that included state-by-state information. I wanted to dig down because I didn't feel that looking at the U.S. As a whole was really very informative, so I apologize for it taking a few days. It's taken a while for me to get this data together in a way that made sense, but I certainly appreciate your patience as I worked on it. So let's go ahead and get started. First thing, again, thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, and click the bell icon to be notified, and share this video with anyone who may like this. All right, let's get started. All right, back on March 30th, I presented some information on states as far as how many cases per million population each state had. So this is that map, and obviously the max red is New York, which had and still has the largest number of cases in the United States. You see that every other state pales in comparison, literally, haha. But yeah, New York was certainly the worst, and then we had some other hotspots. New Jersey, Louisiana was starting to get a little bit darker pink. But at this point on March 30th, New York had 3,427 cases, confirmed cases per million population, which is only 0.3% of its overall population. So let's see how it is doing now. Now, I apologize. These numbers are from April 8th. Because I've been working on this a few days, that's just the latest data that I have. The good news is that I'm trying to illustrate more general ideas in this. I'm showing the data to present general ideas, so I still think it does that. So I apologize for not having the latest data, but just bear with me. Okay, these are the confirmed cases per million population for April 8th. You see that New York is still the worst it's now 7,766. So roughly in 1 week, it more than doubled, and certainly very, very much not good. We see that New Jersey has gotten more pink and closer to New York. Louisiana also certainly is showing to be more of a hotspot. Now, I want to add some perspective to this. While Louisiana in this map actually looks kind of just dark pink, in reality, Louisiana is doing worse. They have a higher case per million than New York did on March 30th. So that just adds some context here. And people who watch the news frequently may recall a little over a week ago, people were panicking about New York's hospital infrastructure being overwhelmed, and that was a week ago. And right now, Louisiana is past where New York was a week ago. So really, really bad situation developing in Louisiana. And I want to illustrate this even further. So I'm going to show today's information on the next slide. I'm going to show today's case data, but I'm going to use New York's number from March 30th as the maximum, and you'll see how much things have developed since March 30th. Okay, here's that chart. So you see Louisiana is now bright red, indicating that it is worse than where New York was on March 30th, and we see every state getting very much more red, which just shows that there has been a lot of growth in cases over the last week or so. And it will not be very long before almost every single one of these states is where New York was or past it on March 30th. And that's not good, because that means that each of these states will be reaching the limit of their hospital infrastructure. The reason I go by cases per million is because I think that hospital beds are likely fairly highly correlated to per million population. So if we look at it in that perspective, we can get an idea when hospital infrastructure is going to be really strained. So, all right. I'm going to go back to using New York on April 8th as the maximum red, just because I want to use it as an illustrative point for the next slide. All right, so again, this is confirmed cases per million. The next slide that I want to look at is growth rate in cumulative cases, or to use the colloquial term, just new cases per million. Okay, so here on this chart on this map is the cumulative cases, and here are the new cases. All right, now I'm going to go back and forth a couple times just to illustrate. Those look very similar. Okay, and when I see stuff like that, the first thing I think of is, I wonder what the correlation is. So I went ahead and plotted that on a chart, on a scatter plot. So here we have new cases per million population on the y-axis and cumulative confirmed cases on the x-axis. And we do see what appears to be a pretty strong direct relationship. But due to the numbers in this and the exponential nature and all that, I'm going to log this on logarithmic scale on both axes. And now we can see that relationship appears even stronger. And this is a linear regression. This 0.928, this basically means that, now I'm not saying that this is exactly the relationship. I'm not trying to get like this to be totally precise here, but just to give you an idea, this does appear to be a decent fit. And this R squared, if it is a good fit, it basically means that 93% of the variation in new cases can be explained by the variation in confirmed cases. Okay, and another way of looking at this is the slope of this line is kind of this is sort of like a bank account. If this was the interest that was being added in each time period, and this was the account balance, this slope right here is basically like an interest rate. So, and I'm going to take a look at the stats in a different way. We have some outliers here. So we have New York, New Jersey, Louisiana. We've already highlighted how those are the worst states, and I would call those outliers. So I'm going to go ahead and remove those. And despite this curvature here, this actually still is a linear regression. And we see a pretty decent fit still with R squared at 0.87 roughly. So again, 87% of the variation in new cases is explained by variation in confirmed cases. This makes sense because if we think about this using the bank account example, if this is your bank account and this is your interest rate, basically it's saying that at each stage, it's basically your bank account that is the determining. Your bank account is the independent variable driving the amount of interest or new cases that's being added to your bank account in each time period. Okay, if this is true on, if we look at all the states and we get a very highly correlated situation between confirmed cumulative cases and new cases, perhaps it's also true if we look at this on a time series. So I went ahead and looked at one state to verify if this is true or not. So here we go. I looked at New York, obviously, because New York is our worst state right now. And so this is the line. Again, we have new cases on the y-axis per million population and cumulative cases on the x-axis per million population. And again, logarithmic scale on both axes. Instead of having each dot be a state, we now have each dot representing a date. So this is New York, with each data point being 1 day. And we see a pretty strong relationship here. Now, just a reminder about theoretically what we can expect. This is the blue line is the cumulative cases. This is just hypothetical, but let's say that we have 0% population down here and we have 100% population up here. Okay, if no social policy was instigated, no mitigation policies were initiated in order to mitigate the spread, we would expect the number of new cases to continue to rise and rise and rise and rise and rise until it got to about 50% of the population, and then the virus would start to confront more people who are either infected or recovered than uninfected. So then the probability of it maintaining the same growth rate would decrease. We would see a decrease in new cases. So the cumulative cases would slow and eventually plateau, okay? And then this orange is that new cases, all right? So knowing that, let's go ahead and take a look at the New York example again. So once again, the new cases are on this axis, the y-axis, and the cumulative cases are on the x. And then, according to that chart, recall the new cases are the orange line. That orange line, we need to see that go all the way back down to 0 before we can say that we actually have success in beating this virus, okay? So let's take a look and see how New York is actually doing. If I plot a trend line on this line, we see that we don't get a very good fit. And this is because at first, New York had no mitigation policies whatsoever. And so the spread of the virus was unmitigated. Okay, so there's a certain the virus is basically like a math equation. It has a certain infectiousness and a certain death rate. I'll talk about death rate here in a little bit, but right now we're just talking about infectiousness. So if it's completely unmitigated, it's a pretty reliable relationship here between cumulative cases and new cases. And basically this is showing essentially 27% being added to cumulative cases every single day, which is an incredibly rapid rate of doubling, incredibly rapid rate of exponential growth, okay? And we see a very high explanatory power then. New York later instigated social mitigation policies. Obviously, we know that New York has, it was a little bit late, if I'm being honest, but it's been very aggressive about instigating social distancing policies. Everybody's seen the pictures of New York City with no cars on the streets, which is very weird to see, but we do see that slope has been reduced from 0.27 roughly to 0.06 roughly, and we do see, and again, these regressions aren't meant for me to indicate this is the actual number. It's just showing a pretty high fit here. Okay, so the slope of this curve has now reduced to from 0.27 to 0.06 roughly. So we're seeing some success in New York's mitigation policies here. All right. If we take this same type of idea of, okay, we separate this line into chunks and we say, what is the slope of each chunk? What I'm going to do on the next slide is look at a 5-day rolling. So each day is a rolling chunk, if you will, and we're going to look at how that slope is changing over time. And it basically approximates the derivative of this curve, okay? So in other words, the change in the new case growth, okay? So here we go. Early on, we see that new cases started at about 30%. So each day was roughly adding 30%. to the whole. We did see some volatility in this, and then it went back to about 30%, and then it's kind of smoothed out, and we've seen a nice deceleration. This is very positive. This is what we hope to see in every single state. Is we hope to see this line. This basically means that when this hits zero, it means that new cases are leveling off. So their cumulative cases are still growing, but they're not growing at an increasing rate anymore. And then once it passes, cumulative cases are still growing, but at a decreasing rate. And we want to see this line continue to trend down even more negative so that cumulative cases plateaus. Okay? So knowing that, let's go ahead and let's take a look at some other states. We knew that we could plot this with New York, so I went ahead and plotted it for every single state in the United States, and that's what this chart looks like. It's a mess, but you basically see that every state has more or less obeyed this law, so to speak, quote unquote, of the spread of this virus. So in the next slide, I'm just going to go through every single state. It's going to go through extremely rapidly. If you want to, you can go ahead and slow down the speed, and that way you can look at each state a little slower. But for the sake of everyone who may not want to spend much time on this, I'm just going to go through all these very rapidly. Feel free to slow it down. Feel free to pause it as you wish. And I will also be including a link to this spreadsheet so that you can not the spreadsheet, this PowerPoint presentation, so you can access this online and peruse it at your leisure if you wish to do it that way. But here we go through all the 50 states and actually some territories as well. Okay, so now that we have gone through all of the states, I'm going to show you some examples of some states that have good trajectories and some examples of states that have bad trajectories. So these are the start of the good examples. So here we see Michigan. It was pretty much unmitigated, and then we started to see a little bit of slowing. When you start to see it bunching up, that's when you know that social mitigation policies are beginning to work. And then we actually see Michigan begin to have, it looks like new cases are actually starting to go down. So very good. New Jersey, obviously one of the worst states as far as total cases, but very positive to see the trajectory starting to turn down. Arizona, downwards. South Carolina, starting to see downwards. And Idaho, starting to see downwards. Idaho at one point had one of its counties had one of the worst cases per population ratios, but there's been some pretty strong orders that the state has done to mitigate the spread. It was a little bit late, but this is certainly a very positive downturn. Now, I want to give you the caveat that there can be some hiccups in this data, so I'm not going to trust any of this is permanent. But you know, these are definitely some glimmers of hope in these states. Okay, so let's go and look at some of the bad examples. Okay, District of Columbia, very high population center, and you know, pretty much no glimmer of hope. I mean, there might have been a tiny bit here where it was starting to bunch and go down, but this is not a good data point. Georgia, this governor in this state unfortunately did not know that asymptomatic people could spread the virus until I think it was like a week ago. So they have been very slow to respond, and you can see that in this trajectory. Rhode Island is up. Maryland, up. West Virginia appears to have not done anything to mitigate the spread. I don't know if this is true that they've done nothing to mitigate the spread, but just according to the data, it just hasn't seemed to pan out yet. Delaware is up. South Dakota is up in a big way. Obviously, very, very much not good. All right, now I'm gonna talk a little bit about this is kind of the whole takeaway that I want you to take away from this video. Okay, important note on these growth rates. I'm going to remind you that we need to see these new cases get all the way to 0 before we can be confident that we have stamped out the spread of this virus. Okay, a reminder that right now New York has roughly as of April 8th, New York had 7,700 cases per million population. Now, these are cumulative cases. Not all of these cases, not everybody in these cases is still ill. A lot of these people are recovered and they're not still infecting the virus, infecting new people. So it's, we're approximating things here, okay? But roughly speaking, the number of cumulative cases is a good variable to describe what will be the new cases going forward if it's unmitigated, okay? So we have social mitigation policies that are beginning to slow, and eventually we will see, hopefully, this start to tick down, and then we want to see this get all the way to 0. But 7,700 per million is only 0.8 roughly percentage of New York's total population. So if social mitigation policies do not continue, then you will still have active cases. And it is not manifest destiny that once this starts to trend down, it will go all the way to 0, okay? So you could very well have, as a reminder, if it's completely unmitigated, the growth of this virus will not begin to slow. New cases will not begin to slow until it reaches roughly 50% of the population. Right now, New York, which is the worst in the nation, is at less than 1% cumulative cases per population. We have no immunity to this virus. It is a brand new virus. So those of us who have not been infected, and now granted, again, I believe that the number of cumulative reported cases is actually underestimated, but I think it's underestimated only, New York might be at 4 or 5%. If we look at the case rate at which it might be if everybody were tested, it might be about 5% of people are currently infected, far below 50%. So without social mitigation policies in place, we might very well start to see a tick downwards, and then people start to feel optimistic too soon, lift the social mitigation policies, and then we start to see new cases just resume their upward trajectory once again. So we can start to have people go back to work and stuff like that if I would encourage everybody to look into what's called antibody testing. Antibodies test to see if you have had the virus and if you're recovered. If we start to roll out antibody testing, then we can start to relax some of these social mitigation policies, but only for those who are testing positive for antibodies, meaning they've had the virus, they're over the virus, and they're safe, relatively safe, if they were to encounter someone else who's sick. Now, there is possibility of the virus mutating. That new person could be sick, but they would still have antibodies that would protect them from a virus. Anyway, I highly recommend that you look into antibody testing. I highly recommend that everybody continue with the social mitigation policies, like social distancing, shelter-in-place orders. I cannot recommend enough that people continue to do that until antibody testing has been rolled out. I highly recommend that people get in touch with their local representatives, even their U.S. senators from their state. I highly recommend that you get in touch with them, because everybody needs to get in touch with their politicians to try to do everything we can to push these antibody tests. That way we can know who is safe to start getting this back to normal, okay? Without risking these growth rates just beginning their upward climb again. If we just relax these social mitigation policies with no intelligence about who we're letting back out, then we're just going to have an explosion in cases again. So, all right, that's all I want to say about growth rates, but I do want to talk just a little bit on death rates. This map right here shows the death rates. Now, death rates are being calculated in this chart as deaths from COVID divided by COVID cases. Okay, so right here in Kentucky is the worst, and that's 5.66%. So that means that 5.66% of their COVID cases have unfortunately passed away. 5.66%. When we look at that versus what we've seen in other nations, it can be quite shocking, because South Korea was only 0.97% of their COVID cases resulted in death. Now, South Korea's only had 200 cases, 200 deaths from COVID, period. And that's in a population of 50 million. Obviously, we have had just an extraordinarily higher number than that, and we're only 7 times their population. So, if to put it in perspective, if our death rate was the same as if we had the same types of mitigation policies that South Korea had put in force, it's possible that our death rate would have only been 1,400 people nationwide. So people, when they see 5.66%, are rightfully quite shocked. And the overall death rate in the U.S. has been about, it's in the high 3% range. So like 3.7, 3.8, somewhere around there. That's a huge number and terrible number. And people, depending on how you view this, some people have been a little bit skeptical that the numbers are actually that high, and I want to talk about that a little bit. So, it is possible that number is too high, and I'll give you an example of why that might be. In the United States, we have tested far fewer people per capita than other nations. For instance, South Korea being a very huge exception. South Korea tested a much larger percentage of its population than we have. And if we had tested more people than this death rate is being calculated as COVID deaths divided by COVID cases. If we have tested more, we likely would find that COVID cases number in the denominator is being underestimated. So if we tested a greater percentage of our population, that number would rightfully be expected to increase, and if the denominator increases, then this ratio would decrease, meaning the death rates would start to look more quote unquote realistic. Now, the other thing that is causing these death rates to be high in some of these places are very real. They could very well be very, very high, because I'm going to go to Washington. I'm sure that many of you might recall that in Washington there was a very bad, basically the deaths in Washington, some of the very first deaths were in a nursing home. Like 80 people died in a nursing home. So, you had the very first start in Washington, you had an extremely high death rate due to it very unfortunately infecting a nursing home and causing a lot of deaths in a very vulnerable population. Kentucky had nursing homes that were infected as well, so it makes sense that the death rates would be high in those two states. I didn't look specifically into Oklahoma, but it's possible that that was the case there too. Now, the other thing that is happening in places like New York, the hospital infrastructure is being overwhelmed. So very, very sadly, the cases have spread too fast for the hospital infrastructure to be able to take care of the people that are getting sick. So, they're having to make some very tough choices about who's going to be put on ventilators. Whereas if the social mitigation policies had been instigated earlier, then the hospital infrastructure may not have been overwhelmed, and care could have been given to all the cases as much as they need to be, which would have resulted in a lower death rate. And so as these cases begin to spread more and more, and each state starts to have a higher number of cases per million population, we can expect, unfortunately, these death rates will be very high. And finally, I want to point out that Italy, which is it's another, Spain is looking pretty bad now, but Italy was a very bad nation before we overtook it in the largest number of cases. Italy was, they actually reported a death rate between 12 and 13% of their COVID cases. And I want to tell you this is going to be disheartening, but Italy actually tested more than twice its population relative. So its testing per population per capita is actually twice as good as ours. So despite testing twice as many people per capita, they actually, meaning that their case rate is more reliable than ours, they had a death rate between 12 and 13%. So I just want to remind everybody that it's really, really important that we mitigate the spread of this disease, because as this disease spreads, hospital infrastructure will be overwhelmed and death rates are going to be extraordinarily high. Now, one final note on this. There are some sources out there that are talking about how all people infected with COVID who die are being called COVID deaths, regardless of whether COVID was the proximate cause of the death. Okay, so there's a lot of talk back and forth on this, but essentially, some sources have a problem with a person who died from pneumonia being said to have died from COVID because they died of pneumonia, and they want that to be called a death from pneumonia. Or let's even though the COVID was the cause of the pneumonia, or let's say that someone has a weak heart and they die from a heart attack, and that heart attack was caused because breathing problems and the lack of ability to breathe resulted in them having a heart attack. Okay, so COVID caused breathing problems, caused a heart attack. Some sources want that death to be called from a heart attack. Okay, but in my worldview, that is a COVID death. Okay, so I think that there's a lot of rationality behind a person who dies that is infected with COVID being called a COVID death. Now, I don't know, because I don't have the data on this, but it's unsure at this point, and I really hesitate to speculate, but I'm just trying to be fair here. I do not know in the event that, say, someone dies from an accidental death, but happened to be infected with COVID. I do not know in that event if people are calling that a COVID death or not. My expectation is the answer is no. but I don't have that data. I intend to find the data and look into it, but I want to encourage everyone not to put too much credibility in this idea that the death rates are being exaggerated because too many deaths are being recorded as COVID that shouldn't be. In fact, I would point to one other thing. In the state of New York, the rate of people that are dying in their houses or apartments that have never been tested is actually going very high. So there are actually a lot of people that are probable COVID deaths that are not being counted as COVID deaths. So in a lot of places, there are reasons to believe that the COVID death rate is being underestimated, not overestimated. So I just want everyone to keep that in mind, but I really want people to keep in mind Italy. Italy tested twice as many people per capita than the United States, and their death rate was 12 to 13%. So we're looking at 5.66%. We're thinking that that is terrible and overstated, but I just want to point out Italy because that could be very much worse. So again, the takeaway from this video is that social mitigation policies are very important. There is no state that I just presented that the new cases have come anywhere close to zero. Most states are just beginning, if they're beginning at all, they're just barely beginning for their new cases to start to level. And if we start to lift social mitigation policies without an intelligent way of getting people back to normalcy, specifically testing people for antibodies and making sure that we're letting the people who are safe back to their normal way of life, we can expect those trajectories in new cases just to continue to rise. And that would be a disastrous result. So with that, I just want to thank everyone for watching. If you found this to be informative, it's certainly not entertaining. I don't have any pleasure whatsoever in presenting this data. It is not good data. But if you found it informative, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to be notified. And please also share this video with anyone else who may find this interesting and informative. And I'll end this just by saying, please, everybody, continue to social distance. Please continue to maintain your thorough hand washing regimens, and understand that social mitigation policies must continue to be followed if we want to continue to mitigate the spread of this disease. So thanks again for watching. Stay safe and healthy out there, and I will see you next time. Thanks again. Bye.